very, very fruitful discussion, and that we learn a great deal more about both history and literature as well as Australia during the course of this discussion. And before we begin, please
RFRF के उनसे निवेदन करूंगा कि वो RFRF का प्रेजेंटेशन दे, कहां से अभी तक हम लोग कहां पर आए.
I would request everyone to mute their mics, please, unless you are planning to speak, because we do have a lot of disturbance. So I will be muting my mic immediately as soon as I hand over to Professor David Lau. And I had circulated the introductions, the brief, the bio briefs of all the speakers. But I do need to say that Professor David Lau is a well-known historian and a very respected academician. And especially interesting is the fact that he is so closely associated with the Asia-Pacific region. And his main focus has been there. And I'm very happy to be able to listen to you again, David. And again, Alison and Alexandra and Tiffany with their various fields and, you know, the kind of knowledge that they bring to this discussion. I think it's going to be a wonderful morning. So, David, with these words, I would like to ask you to begin talking about what you had said you would, which is biographical writing and with certain specificities. So I will be switching off my mic now, and I would like to request everyone else to switch off and just let us listen to David, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malati. And also can I extend my thanks to the Vice-Chancellor for the excellent support too for this event. I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of my colleagues in saying how happy we are to be here and joining you and your colleagues and students. I'll now try to switch to presentation mode and hopefully so perhaps if someone could just say very quickly, is that coming through?
Yes, Professor, we can see your presentation.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to be talking about is the act of biography, which occupied my mind around 10 years ago. And the title is somewhat provocatively called Rescued by Murder, because basically that's what happened to me. I chose to embark on a biography of an Australian politician turned diplomat named Percy Spender, who lived 87 years old from between 1897 and 1983. I never got the chance to talk to him. But I embarked on a biographical project as someone who, before this, had been a historian writing about Australia in Asia and the Pacific, as Malati has mentioned, as a somewhat left-leaning scholar who was now embarked on writing about a conservative politician, as someone who had never really enjoyed the genre of political biography. I always thought there was something too limiting about just being a political biographer. And as someone who had also been becoming increasingly interested in the power of narratives, speeches, but also written works, and how that was influencing the way in which I approached history more generally. On screen is the finished product. It was called Australian Between Empires, The Life of Percy Spender. The reference Between Empires was my attempt to describe a person who simultaneously tried to enjoy the benefits of being an Australian who celebrated his Britishness and his membership of the British Empire, but also embraced the notion of the American century and the change that came with that from mid-century, mid-20th century onwards. There is a picture of Percy Spender. He wasn't a big man. He was only about 5'6". He has very strong credentials as one of the most international Australians of the 20th century. Very briefly, he was a self-made man. He grew up in Sydney in pretty modest circumstances, but he worked extremely hard, had a successful university experience and became a barrister, a very successful one in Sydney, before becoming a politician in 1937 and then subsequently ambassador to the United States during the 1950s. He is still Australia's longest serving ambassador to the United States. I've listed very briefly some of his main achievements. He was Treasurer and Minister for Army during World War II. He then became Foreign Minister for a little over a year and a half, but that year and a half between late 49 and mid-51 is said to be one of the most formative patches in the evolution of Australia's foreign policy. He then became ambassador, as I mentioned, to the US, and then a justice on the International Court of Justice in The Hague. He's the only Australian to have done that. Among his achievements, foreign policy achievements, are especially the Colombo Plan for aid to developing South and Southeast Asia, and the ANZUS Treaty, the security treaty between Australia, New Zealand and the United States. And as I mentioned, he was someone who, far quicker than his peers, really embraced the notion of change led by an American century. He admired everything that was happening in the United States and tried to enmesh himself. He became a director of Goodyear Tire Company, but he also tried to enmesh himself in the ideas that were in the engine of change in mid-20th century America. Now, as a biographer, this was difficult. I faced immediate difficulties. He'd written a lot himself, probably more than most other politicians in Australia. 2 very detailed books are on screen there. There was tremendous detail. He clearly kept a diary which he later destroyed, or perhaps his son has kept hidden. He certainly kept it hidden from me. In addition to that, there were notes in his private papers alerting the reader to the things that he felt were most important. So in a top secret telegram, there would be a marginal note saying this part was really important. And sometimes there were some embellishments too. He was clearly impatient, I could tell, with the way in which other historians hadn't paid sufficient due to his achievements. And in Politics and a Man, that memoir there, Malati referred to Dickens, he actually reinvented parts of his early life. This is a very Australian thing. He smoothed over some of the difficulties he had as a child. He neglected to mention some of his brothers and gave the impression that he was an only child and so on. So Percy was quite inventive in crafting his own story with posterity very much in mind. So all of this created a great challenge for me, as I mentioned, and I struggled with the whole task, the whole conceited task, if you like, of how on earth you capture 87 years of life of someone who has written about it quite determinedly, left a fairly selective record, and whose achievements in foreign affairs I knew much better than his life story more generally. The answer was provided, or at least assisted, in the form of murder. Percy's wife, Jean Spender, was the author of 6 murder mysteries, mostly set in Sydney society, although the last 3 were set in the United States, written between 1931 and 1960. Jean became very much a society figure in Sydney. She was often in the society columns of the newspapers, and there's an early image of her. Interestingly for me, it became very apparent in her murder mystery novels that the hero often bore a striking resemblance to Percy. He was often shorter, of average stature, bearing extremely admirable qualities. So here's one example, The Charge is Murder, 1933, where she mentions the hero, Paul Rawlins, was an alert, resourceful barrister with a tan that much golf and surfing had bestowed upon him. Percy was a keen surfer. He had the ability to tower over others despite his slight build, and coming from a less privileged background, he enjoyed rattling the legal establishment. And she wrote, at one point, after Paul rushes back into his chambers, he became embroiled in the whole murder mystery in this novel. Paul could not help grinning at his ignominious position, having been involved in the whole crime. He imagined the looks of horror with which some of his learned brethren of the bar would view him now, and a little chuckle escaped him. So that's indicative of how Jean was constantly shadowing the career of her husband and providing me with a means to insert this kind of text into my own work, I could quietly subvert the whole idea of a biography that somehow had to capture all the kind of essence of a life that was partly already scripted for me. And I became quite attracted and did in fact use lots of the excerpts of Jean's murder mystery novels. To give you a few other examples, this one from 1938, a novel called Death Comes in the Night. Percy was elected to Parliament in 1937. The hero is again a barrister, KC, King's Counsel, Charles Lambton. He was of commanding appearance and courtly manners, but in Jean's hands he was always very streetwise, very intuitive. He was dashing, just as Percy was always snappily dressed, and a touch ruthless. The villain in this story was Sir Arthur Earp. He was a politician, and he'd shown himself to be insufferably pompous and self-opinionated, she wrote. He was of medium height and thick set, bearing a tight little paunch before him as the banner of his faith. He had a coarse mouth and small shrewd eyes. As one critic pointed out just after this book came out, there was something of an unflattering resemblance between Jean's depiction of Sir Arthur Earp and Sir Archdale Parkhill, who was Spender's chief opponent in his electoral victory to gain his seat into federal parliament. And there's a photograph of the unfortunate Sir Archdale Parkhill. Full Moon for Murder, there was a break between that novel and the next one, but Full Moon for Murder came out at a time when Spender, in opposition, political opposition, but about to come back into power, was leading a push to outlaw the Communist Party of Australia. There's a photo of Jean and Percy about to board a plane. The hero in Full Moon for Murder, again a Sydney-set novel, was Inspector Hartnett. He was quick as light on his feet. There was about him an elusive suggestion of the controlled power that had shocked many an evildoer. And at one point, Inspector Hartnett, says to his colleague, "Many men who have been protected by money all their lives find it difficult to see past their own convenience. I'm no socialist, and I'd cheerfully deport every communist in Australia to their spiritual country. But our Mr. Hollis, another villain, is the sort that breeds socialism." So the villain, the businessman Hollis, was in cahoots with both fascists and communists. In other words, Jean was quite careful to make the point that Percy was not born of money and he was not of old establishment, and that the far right could be just as guilty as breeding extremism. But she also was making the point that communism was anathema to the future of Australia's society. In Washington, Jean continued her writing. The Spenders basically had an extremely busy and successful time in Washington. Percy was much admired. He was very socially outgoing. He was gregarious. And Jean was a wonderful hostess in the cocktail circuit that was the Washington Embassy circuit. They also travelled a lot, including to Latin America. But I became aware from reading some of Jean's novels and also her letters home. She left a collection of letters to her mother of just how tiring things were becoming. Percy's restless energies meant that he was hard to keep up with. And one of Jean's novels from 1958 called 7 Days for Hanging, now the scene was all switched to the United States, had less of a strong sense of separation of heroes and villains. The world was becoming a little bit more merged and murky. She actually references one protagonist, Mary Mitchell, is very much Jean in resemblance. Jean was red-haired and Mary Mitchell was a petite redhead. And at one stage, in the midpoint of the novel, she feels old and grubby and weighed down by experience after being wrongly accused of murdering her former husband. And quoting from the novel, "Even the pictures on the white panelled walls seemed withdrawn. I looked at the portrait of my grandmother. I'd been told I resembled her. There was a little smile curling her lips. For the first time, the smile seemed faintly mocking and scornful. It was around this time that Jean's mother died, and her mother had been a rock in her life. And Jean really bemoaned the fact that she was separated from her mother while being stuck in the United States, and she was tiring of the pace that she and Percy both set. At the end of Washington, as I outlined very quickly, they moved to The Hague, where Percy became a justice on the International Court of Justice. And from The Hague, Jean finished 2 more novels, which were part of a trilogy connecting with that previous one. One was called Murder on the Prowl, and the other was called Death Renders Account. They were both published in 1960. And again, the separation between villains and heroes is much less strong. One of the main characters is a journalist named Dave Owen, and he's increasingly absent in the novel, leaving his wife rather feeling worn out and left to fend for herself. At one point in the novel, looking down on Central Park from a New York apartment, Police Inspector Felix Mann says, "It looks nice, doesn't it? Before morning, there will be murder and assault somewhere down there. A child will be run down, a boy killed in some juvenile gang fight, a man shot or stabbed." The world was becoming far bleaker for Jean. She was struggling in 1960, and this was beginning to tell. Her final piece of writing, compiled mostly from social diaries she kept while in Washington in The Hague, wasn't a work of autobiography. It was called Ambassador's Wife, a title not likely to be repeated today, a woman's view of life in politics, diplomacy and international law. It's rather gruelling reading for its relentless name-dropping, but it also, again, hints at her exhaustion and the fading attraction of the cocktail circuits, which started to wear her down. This was published only 2 years before her premature death in 1970, and it's quite clear that her death was hastened by her turning to alcohol and cigarettes to prop her up as life was getting her down. The long-term wear on her from her rather adventurous, outgoing husband, who ran hard at everything. He ran hard at politics, at the law, at the way in which he wanted his fame to be known, at gathering money. He was hard-wearing as a person to live with, and it became quite tough for most people, including ultimately his wife. And so I'll stop sharing at this point and return to the screen just to wrap up with a few comments. From my point of view, the act, or the conceit really, of trying to pretend that I was capturing someone's life was made far more palatable, in my view, by the literary allusions that I could bring in as leavening, a word that Malati has used in her introduction, as a leavening influence to any pretense, any suggested pretense that I was somehow aspiring to capture every aspect of Percy's life, and also as a subtle corrective to any notion that his life was simply an accumulation of achievements. Because as I found, the way in which his life arc went actually accumulated a sense of growing tragedy, with the way in which it started to wear his wife out. She'd been extremely supportive and extremely loving during their relationship, but ultimately the pace of their life and the circumstances of living with Percy Spender were quite formidable for Jean. So in the act of writing a biography, it became extremely important for me, the historian. They often say that there's a doubleness about writing history. The doubleness consists of the act of trying to approximate a sense of factual accuracy and relating a narrative about how things happened, versus the act of creating a narrative which take you from one part of the journey to another part of the journey in a way that will bring people with you. And for me, that merging, that flowing, as Malati has said, seemed to be facilitated by another act of writing, the continuous writing of Jean Spender. So I'll stop on that note.
Thank you, David. What I did find interesting was that his wife actually wrote books which featured her husband as a character. And I did remark to you earlier, I would have found it much more interesting if she had portrayed him as the villain rather than the hero. Because I'm sure a lot of wives here would really not see their husbands as heroes and would rather portray them as villains. So that's rather interesting.
I think, as I say, I think in the latter part, in the last few novels, there was a blurring of lines.
Oh, that's great, because that's where I think then it becomes more, if she's showing him as a hero all the time, which, as most wives know, their husbands hardly ever are. Uh, I think that would be more of a fictionalized kind of a history. And I'm very glad to know that the lines did get blurred after a while, when she must have thought that she needed to get down to brass tacks and really, really portray the reality as it is. So, well, that was very interesting, David. Thank you so much. Because, like, you were so faithful to our topic, where you brought in both history and literature in the form of the novels, and history in as much as they portrayed a real person, but as a character in a novel. So there was such a merging of the two rivers, as I keep trying to compare these two areas too. And also the fact that she could actually write a novel titled The Ambassador's Wife, which must have drawn very greatly upon her own experiences. That is rather interesting as well. And do you think that there was any point where all the autobiographical elements really got submerged in the fictional, or were they dominant? Was there ever a conflict between these two?
That's a very good question. I think yes, I think if we're talking about Ambassador's Wife, it's the most autobiographical attempt by Jean, of course, although I think she was present in the latter part of her novel writing. The small red-haired petite woman who became very frayed was, I think, Jean. But in her work, Ambassador's Wife, explicitly autobiographical, her own presence is very muted. She tries to remain a very, very much the narrator in the background. And it's a much less engaging book. It's written mostly from social diaries, and it consists mostly of snippets about other people. Her own presence is too muted for it to be an engaging read.
Well, I think we can now go on to Alison, who has come up with a very interesting theme of poetry as the poetry of witness and protest. And she has picked up on a very specific area, that is Chernobyl, which I watched that series lately, and it was fascinating to see how the entire thing transpired, the kind of cover-ups that happened, the kind of heroism that people displayed, in not only physical heroism but also in having the courage to speak out, to speak up, and to bring it to the collective attention. So that was a disaster which brought out the best in so many of us, in so many people. And where Alison wants to talk about, what she wants to talk about, is how poetry especially represents something which is thought to be not representable. For instance, disasters like this, or the nuclear holocaust and things like that. So I think what Alison would like to say is, it would be wonderful to listen to this. And I hope that we are able to gather something from this. And I'm sorry, there seems to be some problem with my appliance, and let me see if I can just remedy it. So Alison, could you?
So am I? Is my screen? Is my PowerPoint showing?
Yep, you're right, Alison.
Yes. Do I need to go into full screen view, David? Is that what you did before?
I think you should go to full screen, Alison.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so I can't see you, but you can see me now, which is a little intimidating. And David, I did want to say before that not only is it amazing that Spender's wife didn't represent him as a villain, she also didn't represent him as a victim, which I think is particularly amazing given the longevity of their relationship. Anyway, So, obviously, the relationship between history and literature is incredibly complicated, even though I think culturally we tend to think of the disciplines in quite opposing terms, that history is a matter of facts, a gathering of evidence. Of different evidence types, whereas literature, of course, is a product of the imagination. It belongs to the realm of fantasy. But of course, we know, and as Malati and David have talked about so well already, that each are profoundly interconnected. And each are reliant on the tropes of storytelling, as I think David's presentation made so clear, including character and setting and plot. And each is reliant as well on persuading a reader of the truth or the reality of what they are describing. So in literary studies, we insist on acknowledging the ways in which a text does not occur in a vacuum, but is the result of so many intersecting factors: social, political, cultural, medical, biological, historical, of course. The poetry, fiction, memoir, essays, they all emerge from very particular times and very particular places. Something that I'm particularly interested in is the ways in which literature can speak to historical events in ways that can reveal the unspoken, and how through literature we can gain access not only to moments in time, but also start to understand how those moments become embedded in our cultural imagination. How we're able to experience, of course, in a mediated way, versions of the past through literary works. And though we have to be careful, I think, always to separate what we know in historical terms versus what we embellish through the imagination or fantasy, and we know that writers are obviously very prone to doing that. So to ground these ideas a little more, I'd like to speak a bit about the poetry emerging from Chernobyl, written by both survivors of the nuclear disaster and inspired by witness testimonies of the event. Chernobyl has become a shorthand way of describing the explosion of a nuclear reactor at the power station in Pripyat in Ukraine on April 26, 1986. The event is often understood in terms of a peculiar binary. There is the very real and very material aftermath of the explosion, including the deaths of the first responders, the evacuation of the town, the poisoning of the community and the landscape, and the efforts to contain the affected area. But it's also marked by censorship, silence, and uncertainty, because so much factual information about Chernobyl, about the causes and its impacts, have been buried, both literally and metaphorically. So the precarity of the zone of exclusion, which is what the area where the explosion occurred is called, remains quite uncertain, as does the ongoing danger posed by the concrete sarcophagus that covers the damaged reactor. So Goetcher and Brunston observed that the causal links to specific illnesses are unclear, they're unprovable, and they're attenuated by poverty and material struggle amongst many of the people most affected. And as a result, most of the effects of the hazard are not fully understood by science, and nor do they seem to be precisely fixed or stable, which produces this really interesting series of ambiguities that evade the senses and descriptive language. So even though the aftermath of Chernobyl is so physically obvious, it's also shrouded in mystery and this persistent anxiety about the long-term consequences of exposure to radiation. It was really interesting to know a few days ago, for example, that there was an article in Japan Today that the families of atomic bomb survivors, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are currently undergoing DNA testing to see if the impacts of nuclear explosions are still occurring in the bodies of their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. So there's so much about nuclear disaster that remains unknown. And because of this, there's a tendency to mythologize in order to compensate for this kind of mystery. And of course, there's nothing like a sense of the mysterious to motivate writers and creators, again, as David's presentation highlighted so beautifully. So perhaps because of its opacity, and I'm a slide ahead of myself, but that's okay, Chernobyl has been inspiration for an enormous number of texts across genres that grapple with the unimaginable, including poetry, but also including prose fiction, essays, journalistic writing, memoirs, and literary criticism. Chernobyl has become, in fact, in the Ukraine, one of the most beloved topics of popular culture, which seems a little macabre and strange, but it's confirmed by a multiplicity of secondary school works, childhood recollections, patriotic spiritual confessions, songs, and yes, even jokes dedicated to the accident. I have to admit that the jokes about Chernobyl, which are made by survivors, are pretty bleak. And I thought I had a dark sense of humour, but I think the Chernobyl jokes definitely win the prize there. I've put my two favourite ones up there. One, of course, a terrible pun, because the radioactive core of the reactor versus the core of but my favourite one is the one which I've quoted below, and it's a very popular one, which reads, "An American robot is on the roof for 5 minutes and then breaks down. The Japanese robot is on the roof for 5 minutes and then breaks down. The Russian robot is up there for 2 hours. Then a command comes in over the loudspeaker, 'Private Ivanov, in 2 hours, you're welcome to come down and have a cigarette break.'" Doesn't get much darker than that. And of course, referring to being on the roof was a reference to the robots they used to try and clean up the radioactive material that was on the roof of the reactor. But because of the levels of radioactivity up there, the robots kept breaking down. And so human beings, of course, were used to do that work instead. In line with other apocalyptic crises, the Holocaust, for example, the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 9/11, Chernobyl adopts a cultural memory associated with global catastrophe, and also a literature obsessed with capturing that which seems most beyond representation. What's really interesting about this, and really important, is that Chernobyl has been heavily censored. In fact, the quote suggests there, Ina Sekenko outlines how reporting any information dealing with the accident was prohibited. Journalists and scholars, writers, poets were only allowed to repeat the official point of view, and there was a complete factual blackout event. Now, this has meant two really important things. The first is that because of the censorship, the people who were in the areas affected by the nuclear accident weren't immediately aware what had happened. And so they were exposed to radioactive fallout for quite a long time after the event. The government didn't want to admit the extent of the disaster, and so it allowed its citizens to carry on as normal for many days and even weeks afterwards. All information about nuclear disasters was removed from public access, including removing books and tearing pages out of encyclopedias from libraries about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So people weren't able to use history to learn from these events, to understand what was happening to them or what might be occurring. And this is important because what was happening to them was also invisible. They couldn't see the radioactive fallout, they couldn't immediately feel it, and so it was really easy to deny what was happening. The liquidators, who were the people tasked with cleaning up the zone of exclusion, were forbidden to write home about their experiences or to keep notes about what was happening. We still don't really know how many people died as a result of Chernobyl. Official records list any number between 30 and 54, while the UN estimates the number is much more like 200,000, with another predicted 93,000 deaths in the future. But of course, people talk, and silence couldn't be maintained forever. As witness testimonies and fictions began to circulate throughout Western media, depictions of Chernobyl helped to shape a social spectacle of nuclear phobia. This in part echoed the fear of the death tank that was associated with Japanese atomic bomb survivors, but it also exoticised the zone of exclusion by way of a really surreal and quite nightmarish imaginary. The effect of the transformation of the nuclear accident into cultural constructions, through which it becomes not only real but also a virtual phenomena, creates this symbolism that is quite haunting and evocative, and also quite troubling, I think, too. So what happened is that images of Chernobyl were aestheticised to draw the attention of viewers and players and readers to consume it as an event. There are computer games such as Stalker and Counter-Strike Chernobyl, which also fuel this morbid voyeurism that's associated with dark tourism, and they start to erode the facts, the historical facts of the real world through these very heightened replicas. So To be fair, Chernobyl did offer quite an incredible range of images, and it's easy to see why people are drawn to them. Even the photograph on the slide here is an artifice. It's a construction. Someone's put a gas mask on the haunting toy doll there. But there were some very real images and some very real occurrences that are incredibly vivid. So in reading witness testimonies, for example, there are accounts of farmers who wrapped their cows in cellophane to protect them from radiation, people drinking litres and litres of vodka because they believed it protected them from sickness. Apparently Stolichnaya is the best vodka for that. And something that really touched my heart was that people left goodbye notes to their houses. So when the liquidators went in to clean up and to make sure that nobody was there, they'd find these notes on kitchen tables where families had thanked their homes and apologised to them for leaving them and for abandoning them. So you can see from my quote from one survivor there, they said that how bizarre it was that people were creating these invented scenes, because Chernobyl itself is already so unimaginable, but artistically people wanted to heighten that and to make more and more of it. Now, because no one could see the radiation, as I mentioned, it was relatively easy to pretend that nothing was happening and to deny that hundreds of thousands of people were killed. The result of this censorship and denial was that the victims were never really acknowledged, still haven't been acknowledged, and few people were aware of the suffering that was caused by Chernobyl. And because of this, a lot of the poetry written by Chernobylites, which is the name for survivors of the disaster, really focused their anger on this silencing. The poetry is furious. It has such a bubbling sense of resentment in most of it, and they insist on making sure that people know what happened to them. A lot of this poetry also hasn't been translated into English, which I think is quite telling, and again makes it really hard to uncover these voices. But also,
Alison,
yes,
Alison, if I could just interrupt, are you still sharing your screen?
yes, is it dropped out?
No, it's not visible at the moment.
Ah, hang on. Let's have a look. Sorry. It has such a bubbling sense of resentment in most of it, and they insist on making sure. Oh, it sounds like we've got a bit of a lag in the presentation. Oh, technology.
Yes.
How is that better now?
Yes, we can see it now.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure I got up. Sorry about that. Technology is a bit of a beast in these COVID.
Yes, I know.
So anyways, I was saying a lot of the poetry written by Chernobylites is activist poetry. It's a poetry of protest. It's resisting silence. It's resisting censorship. And Lyubov Sirota is one of the most well-known Chernobyl poets. And she relies quite heavily on images of ghosts and haunting, which I think makes sense given the ways in which these people were denied a voice. And as you can see from some examples of her poetry there, something that's really interesting about Chernobyl poetry generally is that it really draws on the invisibility of the radioactive fallout as a trope, and many of the poets draw on imagery in which the real and the unreal collide in really disturbing and ambiguous ways. The subject of Sirota's poems occupies a liminal positionality, for example, haunted by zombies, and survivors are presented as the living dead who exist in this suffocating in-between space that's both physical and otherworldly. Sarah Phillips has a bit to say about this. I won't read the quote out, but basically she talks about the fact that the radiation was so elusive and mysterious and unseen and unknown that writers trying to convey this tried to translate Chernobyl into very concrete and material terms to make it real and to make it something that people couldn't ignore. And so another tactic of Chernobyl poets has been to really concentrate on the horrors of the body. And Mario Petrucci has written this incredible book called Heavy Water. And in Heavy Water, the poems there are based on a series of oral histories and oral testimonies. And he uses them to create these narratives of the individuals who suffered, including the first responders. His poetry is often cited in activist campaigns fighting for nuclear disarmament because they so powerfully reveal what can happen when nuclear power goes wrong, essentially. one of the most graphic, and I won't read the poem to you because it is, it is quite horrific, but one of the most graphic is his rendering of the testimony of Ludmila Ignatenko. Her husband Vasya was a firefighter and one of the first to respond to the Chernobyl fire, the Chernobyl explosion. And if you've seen the HBO version, the television series, quite a lot of time is dedicated to the narrative of this couple. And I think their story, they were so young, they were so innocent. Ludmila was pregnant. They knew so little about what was happening to them. It captures so much about Chernobyl as an event more broadly. The poem is quite interesting because it uses fragmentation, and a lot of trauma poets do this. So poets writing about 9/11, poets writing about Hiroshima, poets writing about the Holocaust, they use fragmentation because it's the only way, well, it's regarded as the only way to break down something that was so terrible into a means of being understandable. So focusing on the bodily, focusing on the parts of the body specifically, and trying to objectify it. So trying to describe the material facts of what is occurring to individuals rather than dealing with the ineffable or the spiritual per se. These poems are so important because they do represent these interconnections between history and literature so neatly and so powerfully. And they use the grotesque to convey the nightmare of Chernobyl and the nightmare of trauma and what happened to its first responders. But one survivor has also commented that literature stepped back in the face of reality. And it's important to keep in mind how literary works often compensate to make up for what seems impossible to really represent. And in doing that, they can risk distorting historical fact. As I mentioned before, there's been so many films, video games, science fiction and fantasy novels emerging from Chernobyl, and all of them are guilty of creating images that invite consumers to objectify this period of history as something entertaining and as something that can be packaged up in attractive ways. And if you think, well, how on earth could you make Chernobyl attractive or something you'd want to be entertained by or consume, then a very simple Google search on Etsy and Redbubble and even eBay shows that you can buy quite a lot of Chernobyl merchandise, including phone covers, coasters, mugs, face masks, T-shirts. It's kind of horrific. You can buy a snow globe of Chernobyl as well, and what's particularly awful is that when you shake that snow globe, it has ash that comes down, and you can buy tins where they claim to include bits of earth from Chernobyl or samples from the air. Now, this seems really bleak and horrifying, but it's not unique. You can also take a tour of the zone of exclusion in Pripyat, much like you can visit the concentration camps in Poland, visit sites of disaster in Hiroshima, New York, and so on. This is something that theorists of dark tourism have talked about quite a lot, and the way in which literature plays a really problematic role here, because it can make historical events and historical trauma and tragedy seem really appealing, because it creates a sense of mystery. You can see, I'm not sure if you can zoom in, but on one of the T-shirts, Chernobyl has been designed much like the Disney logo. So, there's some pretty alarming connections there that are happening. And I have to admit, I've been a little bit guilty of this myself in the past. I don't own any Chernobyl merchandise, but Hiroshima has a Hello Kitty range of atomic bomb merchandise, and I may own some of that. And it just shows that if the aesthetic appeals, the worlds collide in some very uncomfortable ways. So to sum up, I think I've been talking for far too long now, but literature can be a really powerful way to give voice to those who have historically been silenced. But it is a really complicated relationship. But I think the point that I would keep coming back to is that even though writers are thwarted by the fact that things such as Chernobyl are unrepresentable, if no one attempts to portray these tragic events, then they are forgotten and they are lost in history as well. And I'll leave you with one of Sorota's poems there, but I'll also remove the show to end the show and hopefully not sharing anymore. Hang on, let's turn this off. There we go. And apologies for the tech issues halfway.
Thank you, Alison. I think you really walked us through not just the literature part of it, the poetry writing part of it. It was also how, like you said, something that is said to be not representable is actually made visible in a certain sense to people who were not part of it and who could not even imagine the horror of it. So it brings it home to us in a very raw kind of a fashion. I think when you read poems written about such disasters, and you also read the news related to such disasters, there is such a vast difference because the news is just reportage. It just tells you what happened. And of course, the way news channels go about it these days, they do make it sensational and dramatic. But then when you read poetry, as something that that really conveys what happened, it I think it really touches a nerve. It goes straight to your heart. And I probably an essay would not be able to do that as a poem might. And you so rightly pointed out that the dangers of commodification is so much there. Like, for instance, with Auschwitz and Dachau, like, it's become a tourist spot. I mean, you may go there and feel horrified about what happened, but it doesn't take away from the commercial aspect of the whole thing. Of course, Chernobyl is, far too dangerous to be visited at the moment, but there's no saying when that could be changed into a tourist spot as well.
Oh,
So
you can visit Chernobyl and do a tour.
at the moment,
Yes.
oh, oh, I didn't know that. But then
Yeah.
that would be too much of bravado, don't you think?
I mean, I was
To
tempted,
actually,
but it's
you were
horrifying to
okay.
think that you could go somewhere that is physically so dangerous to you. And
Absolutely.
people do. And what's interesting is the way in which tourism takes over. And
Yes,
you can look at any
yes.
monument for any disaster in the world and see people posing next to them as though it's, a view of the ocean or the Eiffel Tower or something slightly, more innocent. There was a
Right.
really interesting project done a few years ago in Berlin, which has that incredible monument with the stones, and you walk through the stones and they get taller and taller as you go in. Incredible representation of how the Holocaust evolved. But people were posing on the stones, they were doing yoga on them, they were, being a little bit romantic on the stones. And so an artist actually gathered all those pictures and superimposed them with photographs from the Holocaust itself and the suffering of the people there, just to remind you that while you're doing your downward dog pose on this monument, this is what it represents. And, to show you the kind of incredibly discomforting relationship between dark tourism, commercialism, the objectification of trauma, and the history that it actually represents and stands behind it.
Mhm. Which brings me to another aspect of your presentation, which is the dark humor. And the thing is that I think that is a defense mechanism, don't you think?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that when something becomes just too intolerable, it becomes so unbearable that you practically seem to be losing your mind. The only way you can stay sane is to joke about it.
I agree, and I'm someone
Yeah.
who regularly resorts to terrible humor, dark humor, in order to cope with difficulty. And I think reading any of the oral histories of people who survived Chernobyl, it's really bleak. The jokes are really bleak and very raunchy as well. And I think, there's a clear link between sex and death, but definitely it's how do you cope with something? And again, for them, that humor actually functions as a way of representing the unrepresentable. Humor
Mm-hmm.
to distill something so horrific in very powerful and very evocative ways that may make you laugh, but there's that moment of profound reflection afterwards about what that joke might symbolize as well.
No, but then is there a line that one cannot cross where humor is concerned? For instance, is it okay for survivors to make jokes about it, but not for people who were not part of it?
Yeah, oh gosh, that's an ethical question, isn't it? And I mean, I would certainly suggest that is the case. I think I think that's survivor territory. I think there's an ownership over that experience that doesn't belong to anyone else. And, you know, we all know that famous quote as well about there can be no poetry after Auschwitz. I'm paraphrasing badly, but this idea that
Yes,
representation
yes.
belongs to the people who lived it,
Mm.
and visitors and onlookers have no right to represent. And I think that applies to dark humour as well as to any other literary format.
Mhm. For instance, somebody who survived Auschwitz may make jokes about it, extremely bleak and extremely telling jokes, but I don't think anyone else should. Like
I
you said,
agree.
it's
I agree. Yes,
right.
absolutely.
Because if
Yes.
I've not been a part of it, I have, if I've not been part of that pain and the suffering and the bitterness and all of that, I have no business being a part of the laughter bit of it. I
Yeah,
mean,
that
the laughter, of course, is not pure laughter. It has a lot of pain, right?
I agree.
And it's just a way of expressing that pain.
Yeah, it belongs to the people who survived it.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Alison. And
My pleasure.
I noticed that we've been getting a lot of comments, and but I'm unable to access it at the moment. But a lot of them have been, both for you and David, saying that you brought up very important aspects which really need to be addressed, and people have really loved what you have been saying. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's a
And
pleasure.
moving on, could I now call upon Tiffany, who would like to speak to us about Indigenous epistolary histories? And letter writing is so much a part of history as well as literature, because it not only weaves in the historical elements, the sociological elements, it also brings in the personal and how the personal has been affected by the sociological, the political, and the cultural environment of that time. And especially for Indigenous Australian writing, it has, for a long time, it was a very, very neglected area till Indigenous people actually started telling their stories. And it was sometimes on their own, but most often through white intervention. And one of the saddest parts I always thought of Australian history was that the Aborigines who were there always, who were there much before the others, the white people came in, they were not even considered citizens of their own country. It was so much later that a referendum was passed and they were considered citizens. And one consolation was that, but as late as I think 2008, please correct me if I'm wrong, as late as 2008, an apology was tendered to the Indigenous people for the stolen generation, all of that. And but I wonder how much of a reparation that really constitutes, and how it reflects upon what happened and what is still happening. Because I really do not think that Indigenous people have assumed the kind of place in society that they should, and what they themselves aspire to. And there are still so many restraints of so many kinds. There's so much discrimination yet that, which is far from an ideal society. But then I suppose it's true of all societies. But with the Indigenous people of Australia, we have a very large body of writing that has come to us in the form of life writings. Sally Morgan, for instance, so many others who have woven in not just their own lives, but the lives of their families, the lives of their extended families, and especially the life writings by women are not just an account of their own lives, but an account of the entire community. So I really look forward to this, Tiffany, because you are bringing us to an extremely important aspect of Australian society, history, writing, literature, which is Indigenous Australian writing. And you will be focusing specifically on the letter writing bit of it, which opens up such worlds, both personal, social, political, all of that. So I would like to invite Tiffany to make a presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Malati, and thanks for including me in this very exciting seminar today. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So I'm going to share some Aboriginal letters here today, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the Aboriginal families who have given me the permission to share these with you. And here I'm considering Aboriginal letters as a form of literature, a literary genre in themselves, but also as inspiration for Aboriginal literature and histories by their descendants of the letter writers. So I'm also going to talk about Indigenous writers in different genres and across eras. And I've been thinking a lot about, when I've been talking with Alex Rodzinski, who you'll hear from next, about science fiction, I've been also thinking about the kinds of genres in which Indigenous Australian writers have written into and really forged as well. Claire Coleman, this writer here, her recent book, Terra Nullius, is a work of speculative fiction, a historical novel set in Western Australia in the early 20th century, in which the Indigenous people are humans and the settlers are alien invaders who have taken the Earth as the newest corner of their galactic empire. Coleman is an Aboriginal writer from the southwest of Western Australia, and she believes that the genre of